Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is a brief introduction on how to play Lizardmen. My name is OpenTrap, and I've made this for my Discord server, OpenTrap's Total War Warhammer and Used Car Sales Lot. We are a Total War Warhammer 3 multiplayer community that focuses on narrative campaigns. And while I've made this for some of the newer players in my server, anybody else is of course free to watch this, and if you do, I hope you find it interesting. And if you're interested in joining some of our narrative campaigns, I'll include a link to our Discord in the description of this video. But this is meant to be a brief introduction. I'm not trying to give out anything specific because my hope is that with this video I can sort of show some of the newer players or players who aren't familiar with Lizardmen what tools they have available and generally how they work, but then leave the rest of it up to them. Let them find their own voice, so to speak, with how they play the Lizardmen, figure what they like to do, what works best for them, so on and so forth. I'm not trying to give them anything really specific like, if you play Krokgar, you have to recruit these units on this turn, get this tech immediately. No, we're not doing that. This is just a general overview of the tools you have available. The rest is up to you. Now, first things first, I do want to go over how the Lizardmen fight, because understanding how the Lizardmen fight, how they want to fight, is going to inform sort of the rest of your decisions as far as your campaign goes. What kind of units you want to recruit, how you use them in battle, how do you modify your army for specific matchups, so on and so forth. Some of the key concepts to Lizardmen in battle would be line breaking, infantry, monsters, and believe it or not, a surprising amount of range damage. The Lizardmen are, in fact, the poster child of the Stompy playstyle, which is to say, they use their mass to break apart enemy formations and then the raw strength of all their units to then crush the disorganized enemy. That being said, however, they do have plenty of room for tactics and finesse. They're not just a stupid point unit at enemy, look away, battle's won. Now I'm going to go over each sort of category that I've put together of the different Lizardmen units to explain their strengths, their weaknesses, and how they generally want to be used. The first of these is going to be the Saurus. Saurus are your mainline infantry. You have the Saurus with clubs, you have the Saurus with spears, then the Temple Guard also count as Saurus infantry. They make up your primary frontline fighters, and they're incredibly strong. They will beat most other factions' infantry of a similar tier or level. And, for example, if you were to compare them to the Empire Swordsmen, Saurus will, with shields, the warriors that you can see here on the left, their stats are on the right. They have 50% more HP per entity. They have double the armor, nearly double the weapon strength, significantly more leadership, much more mass, and they have 2 passive abilities that can buff them further. Now, your Saurus can be used in a few ways. The first is as a primary frontline that will close with, engage, and destroy the enemy in close quarters combat. The second is as a defensive holding line. This is especially true for Saurus with spears and Temple Guard. They can use their high mass to hold back the enemy as well as their charge defense and protect your more vulnerable units. And then the third is as a follow-up to formation disruption, particularly with your monsters that will charge in, break up enemy lines, or missile units or spells or what have you that can disrupt formations. The Saurus can immediately follow up and they'll do significant damage in close quarters combat with an enemy who isn't in a sort of braced and organized formation. Next we have the Skinks. Skinks are your support infantry and cheap line fillers. They're pretty much worse than Saurus at close combat, melee combat across the board. However, they're significantly more expensive. They're also pretty easy to access, and they're extremely versatile. They're very fast, and they provide good options for flanking with infantry. And as I mentioned, they're very versatile. You can get basic sword and shield versions that you see here on the left. You can get anti-armor axe-wielding variants, or you can even get missile variants or others that have sort of specialized roles. One in particular that I want to point out would be the Skink cohort with javelins. They have the exact same melee profile and stats as the regular Skink cohort, but for slightly more gold, they also come with a range attack that's actually decently powerful for their price and what they do. And last of all, for the skinks, I want to mention that they buff and are buffed by Croxigors. So if they're in close proximity to each other, they both become stronger. So even into the late game, you should be seeing skinks. If not for how cheap they are, uh, perhaps for their specialization, or just for the fact that they can buff Croxigors to make them even better. And next we have the cavalry. Lizardmen have decent cavalry, believe it or not. Horned ones are definitely your most elite, while Cold Wind Riders are easily accessible. And then Ripperdactyls are your flying cavalry. Typically, the way you want to use these guys in your army is to pressure enemy backlines. Keep your big dinosaurs safe from guns by having these guys potentially destroy the guns before they can, start shooting your big dinos, as well as exploiting formation disruption and then just providing a strong mobile core of units for your army. An example of how to use these guys could be having some Ripperdactyls dive the gun line just as you're about to make your charge with your Saurus and your dinosaurs and whatnot. In this situation, the enemy has to make a decision. If they send their melee units to try and defend their missile units, then your charge is going to be able to sweep aside whatever units remain, take advantage of the fact that they're not braced, and really just blow apart the enemy formation. Otherwise, if they don't send their melee units to try and protect the missile units, then you've wiped out their missile units for free, and then once they're gone, you can start easily cycle charging the rear of the enemy units. And you can use the cavalry, the ground cavalry, the same way you'd use the Ripperdactyls in this example. They just have to go around the army rather than over it. Now, the monstrous units are definitely what everyone thinks of when they think about the Lizardmen. They're definitely our most iconic units, and I'd say they're probably some of the most impactful units that you can bring in any of your armies. They're actually very versatile as well. They can serve the function of line breakers, damage dealers, artillery, support units, and for some of the smaller monsters, your typical ranged units. Now, your line breakers are units such as the Bastillodons, Stegodons, Dreadsaurians, even Croxigors, but really every single monster in this category, barring some of the smaller range ones, can be a line breaker. The typical characteristics of these line breakers are they're tough, they're heavily armored, they have a decent charge bonus, they have a ton of mass, and they can use this to break up the frontline formations and get into the back line to start disrupting their ranged units as your Saurus and your Skinks follow through and tear apart the front line now that they're all disrupted. Or if, for whatever reason, the initial charge doesn't disrupt the back line, they have really good attack animations that are good at disrupting formations. And as the battle goes on, you can use the line breakers to cycle charge enemy units and continue to support the rest of the army. While they may not be the biggest killers in the army, they may not be the killiest units you have, they can still do very well for themselves in that regard. But more so than anything, they're used to create opportunities for the rest of your army to really get in there and do the bloody work that the old ones demand of you. The Carnosaur is another one that I think really falls into the category of damage dealer. While it's not as good as Bastillodons or Stegodons, Dreadsaurians, whatnot, at breaking the lines, it is very fast and it can do a lot of damage very quickly. And so it's best at hunting down hard targets such as other enemy monsters or lords or heroes, or hard targets, things that require something really powerful or specialized to kill it. They can still break lines, but they aren't nearly as tanky as some of the other units. So they're best hunting down hard targets and then alternating as a secondary role to a line breaker, rear charging, support units, something like that. But they can definitely make a difference, even outside of that primary role of hunting down hard targets. The artillery monsters that we have are the exact same unit as their base version. They just have some kind of range weapon mounted on them. You get like Bastillodons with solar engines, or your Stegodon, Ancient Salamander, Troglodons. They can be medium to long range or up to short range artillery. But they are actually very solid for what they are. And while they're not going to be winning any crazy artillery duels with factions that specialize in artillery, think, say, the Empire, Cathay, the Dwarves, they do provide some pretty good range firepower for your army, and more importantly, they aren't easy to kill. Someone can't use the Menace Below on your artillery with this faction and expect to kill it or even significantly disrupt it. They can kind of just ignore it. And when they run out of ammunition or when the fighting gets too close, they can just charge in because they're still giant monsters. In the case of, say, the Bastiladon with Solar Engine, I mean, it's still a Bastiladon. It's a heavily armored, hulking beast. But by and large, they're actually very good, surprisingly good. But a lot of people don't expect the range game of the Lizardmen to be that impressive. Another interesting thing about them is most of them are either tall enough to shoot over the heads of your front line, or they shoot in a mortar-like arc, so they can still get over the front line. And in particular, I want to point out the Ancient Salamander, which isn't a giant armored hulking beast like the Bastiladon or the Stegodon, but it can still do okay in melee if it has to. But more importantly, it has a really good firing arc like a mortar, and its blessed version has an airburst projectile, which allows it to do some very serious AoE damage with its shots, and it can really support your front lines. Now, support monsters offer a variety of buffs and debuffs, depending on which one in particular. For instance, the Revivification Crystal lets you heal your units and revive dead ones, whereas the Arc of Sotek can heavily debuff enemies in an area. And again, these units, not only do they have these extra abilities, but they're still giant monsters, so you can use them like a line breaker or however else you see fit. But they're very useful, very supportive to your armies, and they can actually really make a difference in certain situations. The last one I want to talk about here would be the missile monsters, which none of them are currently pictured, but this would be, say, your Salamander hunting packs or your Razordon hunting packs. You could say that they're more akin to missile cavalry, but they're monsters, so I'm going to call them monsters. These guys, believe it or not, they can do a lot of range damage. They pack a serious punch, one that people don't tend to expect. This even includes Pterodon riders. You can actually trade very well into enemy missile formations with these guys. They're fast, pretty maneuverable, and again, unlike your typical archer or whatever, they don't die that easily in melee combat, so they're hard to just pick off without dedicating some serious force to actually wiping them out and removing them from the battlefield. Now, speaking of monsters, I wanted to talk just briefly about Rampage. Most of the monster units, barring a few special ones, will have an ability that causes them to go on a rampage, which means you can't control them, and they're going to either attack the nearest enemy, or if they're not around, they're just going to kind of wander around randomly, break formation. Regardless, you can't control them. It can be kind of dangerous. And this happens after they reach a certain HP threshold, as in they start losing health, they become rampaged. Now, your lords and heroes will have some sort of effect like the one here on screen, which will stop that rampage temporarily. That's very important if you want to maintain control of these monsters, but it's only temporarily. If they aren't healed over that HP threshold, they can still rampage again. So it's important to have sufficient lords and heroes in your army that are positioned in the right locations to ensure that you can keep control of your monsters, because you do not want to have your Stegodon be stuck in melee with a bunch of pikemen, spearmen, halberds, whatever, when it could be cycle charging, disrupting formations, hitting the back line, whatever. So make sure you have some kind of preparation for keeping your units in check. Now, spawning sequences and blessed units are one of the most powerful aspects of the Lizardmen roster. It's very, very important. Many of the blessed units have different abilities or stat tweaks that can radically adjust how they function, and they can even make some relatively low tier units worth considering. There are a couple standout examples, such as the Ancient Salamander that I already mentioned, which gets airburst attacks, the regular Salamander hunting pack, which gets anti-infantry shots with bigger AoE damage rather than the anti-large shots before, the Razordon hunting pack, which gets stalk and snipe, making them very stealthy, or even the skink cohort with javelins. Their ammunition is not only doubled, but it even gets armor sundering, which can be very useful against heavily armored opponents. So you should definitely compare and contrast the different versions of your units that can have a blessed version, because with blessed units, they can really change what they do and make something that you weren't considering before exactly what you need for some sort of coming encounter. Now, spawning sequences are very important. This is, of course, the sort of the currency that you pay to get your blessed units. The primary way you gain them for most of the campaign is going to be through the Rite of Awakening, which you can see here on the right. And it's imperative that you use the Rite of Awakening as soon as it's available every time it comes off cooldown. And I know this sounds a bit specific, but trust me, this is really, really important. This isn't me telling you how to play the game. This is a sheer basic knowledge check, because there's zero cost to using the Rite of Awakening, and it just gives you more spawning sequences in a big chunk. And it gets you another Slan Mage Priest into your recruitment pool. You don't have to recruit it right away. You can get it later. There's no reason whatsoever to sit on this right. You should use it immediately every time it becomes available. Now, later in the campaign, you'll also get access to some buildings, and you can use some edicts to get more spawning sequences, but Rite of Awakening is definitely the main way to do it. And you should also be precise with how you use your spawning sequences, because it's not a resource that you get often and a lot, and the first couple blessed units you get are going to be very impactful for the entire campaign. Now, next is the Geomantic Web. This is kind of one of the unique standout mechanics of the Lizardmen, and it can confuse some people. So I'm just going to tell you very basically, it's not that important. You don't have to worry about it too much. All the Geomantic Web does is, as it gets stronger in any given province, it makes it so that your edicts in that province are more powerful. And that's great. That's free buffs. However, your control over the Geomantic Web is pretty low early game, and you really have to scale before you can actually start using the buffed up Geomantic Web. The way you buff it up is by controlling neighboring territory to your provinces, and then in all those provinces there are these buildings that you can build in the capital settlement, and that building is going to buff up the strength of the Geomantic Web. So if you're wondering why your Geomantic Web is staying orange, it's at the base level, it's because you need to build up these buildings. They start at tier 3, they're only in the capital settlement. They're pretty good though, so when you get the opportunity, you should probably build them. But it's something that's going to happen over time, so don't worry too much about it. Now, the last thing I want to do for this little introduction is to go over some example army compositions, just so you can see what some options are. Understand this isn't a be-all, end-all. You don't have to just follow these sort of examples. Do what you think is best. Do what suits your faction. This is just random examples to give you an idea of what you could do. Now, the first here is what I call the traditional army. An army that plays like how, say, the Empire is going to play. It has a basic front line of units that are meant for holding and fighting and can do a decent job. You'll have some cavalry for flanking and mobility. You'll have artillery to soften up the enemy, force them to come to you, duel with their artillery, whatever. And then a decent backline of missile units. Sort of like how in the Empire you'll have, swordsmen or halberds in the front, and some Reichsguard on the flanks, and some cannons in the back line, and some handgunners and crossbowmen. This is literally the same type of play style as that, and you can actually do that with Lizardmen just fine. People don't really think of them as a faction that can do that. They think giant monsters, but this is a very valid play style, and if that's what you're comfortable with, go for it, man. Now, the Dino Ball is what people expect. It's very Lizardman, iconic, and it's extremely powerful. But you shouldn't just use dinosaurs in it. You should definitely have some units to follow up, because your feral stegodons, for example, aren't going to do a whole lot of killing. I mean, they can cycle charge and do a lot of damage that way, but they're really good at disrupting the enemy and being a nuisance, being hard to kill. But a few infantry, maybe a few Kroxigors, a little bit of cavalry, something like that, thrown into the mix is really going to help you sort of land that killing blow and finish off the enemy a lot faster. But the Dino Ball relies primarily on all your big stupid dinos, be them the artillery pieces, the support pieces, or the line breakers, or the damage dealing feral carnosaurs, whatever. It's really powerful, really hard to kill, and I highly recommend that you bring a life slan because you're going to want to heal these guys as they draw a lot of enemy attention. And that's kind of one of the strengths of having small entity units, single entity units, is that you can heal them and actually take very little damage by the end of the fight if you take the time to heal them up and take care of them and buff them up. Now, the line breaker is kind of what playstyle I prefer with the Lizardmen, personally. And I would consider this to be the most balanced list that you can kind of put together. You can take a core of Saurus, some big dinos, some range units, and you use the range units and the big dinos to break apart the enemy front lines. And then you exploit that and follow it up with the Saurus, while the range units and the big dinos then focus their attention to the back line and keep that in disarray, and then you just kind of pick the enemy army apart piece by piece. You could use cycling charges and really tangle up the enemy. I'd say for sure this is the most well-rounded of all the lists. And then the last example army I have is the Skink Horde. This is for when you're trying to go wide. Skinks are actually very effective for what they are, especially when they're led by the red-crested skink chief. He has a lot of unique skills that can really buff up your skink army. But you can do anything from just having a bunch of skink cohorts because it's cheap and you just need to get more bodies on the field, to including some specialist units like the red-crested skinks, which are armor piercing. You could put in chameleon skinks for some good range trading, chameleon stalkers. But I think generally you also want to throw in maybe a couple support units, maybe a few big dinos, just to add something that the skinks don't have. It still keeps it cheap because the bulk of the force are these skinks that are, worth, I think it's like 75 upkeep on the basic cohort. And then you just throw in a couple big powerful units like dinos or croc scores, especially croc scores. They can really round out that list. But this is really how you go wide or bring some sort of specialist tailored army to take out something in particular. And that's that. That's my introduction to Lizardmen. I hope you people found it helpful. If you have any questions and you're in my Discord, feel free to message me or at me in general or whatnot. If you are not a part of my Discord and you have questions, feel free to join it. If you want to join us for our thematic multiplayer campaigns, do so as well. I hope you found this useful, like I said. Maybe a little entertaining, probably not. And I hope you guys have a good day. And I hope you get a good night's sleep tonight. Thanks for watching.